Welcome to Politics in the Pub. Thank you for your modest attendance. Look, on your behalf, let me acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Let's acknowledge and express our gratitude for their stewardship of the land, past and present, and with regard to the appalling environmental policies of the present government, their stewardship for the future. Tonight's topic is also, that tribute to Indigenous people is apt, because tonight's topic is also about the predicament and the conditions of highly vulnerable people. The barbarism of the bipartisan Australian policies regarding the treatment of refugees. And it's pretty obvious from your attendance that we have probably two of the best box office draw speakers on this important topic. Julian Burnside QC is one of the greatest barristers in this country. Most of his practices in commercial litigation, trade practices and administrative law, but we know him, and I may say love him, for his standing up for justice and for human rights for asylum seekers and refugees, and that's why he's here. And that's why he's come up from Melbourne to be an important part of this public forum.
I was very interested in Phil's reference to Nigel Farage, who, on any view of things, is kind of conservative, I guess you'd say. He opposes the Australian technique of dealing with boat people. There's one person in England who I'm aware of who is notoriously in favour of the way Australia deals with boat people. Her name is Katie Hopkins. She wrote an opinion piece in the London Sun a month or two ago. And she said how good Australia was in relation to boat people. This was at the time when 700 people drowned off Lampedusa. But her compliments had the force taken out of them when she referred in passing to boat people as vermin and cockroaches.
That's right.
Now, I've never seen such a striking reminder of Germany in the 1930s than reading that opinion piece. And that is the sort of person who approves what we are doing. We really need to feel ashamed. Phil's examples of the things that are happening, especially to Hazaras in Afghanistan, brought to mind the story of a guy that we were in contact with. He was on Nauru, Hazara from Afghanistan. You may remember that at the start of 2002, the Americans said that the Taliban had been removed from Afghanistan and it was therefore safe for Hazaras to be sent back. Yeah. Australia forced a number of Hazara refugees who were on Nauru, forced them to go back to Afghanistan, dumped them as close to Kabul as they dared go. And this guy, instead of fleeing straight away to get out to Quetta, this guy went back to his village, I think in Ghazni or Uruzgan. He went back to the village where he'd grown up, and the Taliban heard that he was there. And they came and they found him and they dragged him out of his house. And in front of the other villagers, they threw him down the well and then dropped a hand grenade after him. Never, ever underestimate the brutality with which the Taliban are bent on destroying every Hazara they can meet. Kate and I have had Hazaras living at our house since 2002 or thereabouts. And the youngest of them came to us as an 11-year-old, and we put him through primary school and secondary school and now university. He is now an Australian citizen, but he went back to visit his parents in Quetta 2 years ago and came back shell-shocked at how frightening it was. He most of the time dared not go out in the street because every day there were new notices on the lampposts identifying the Hazaras who'd been killed in the street the day before. If you go into the streets in Quetta or anywhere in Afghanistan as a Hazara, you are at risk of being picked off by Taliban snipers because that is the work they do. Now, we seem to be completely unfazed by things like that. We are troubled, it seems, about the idea of people drowning in their attempt to get to safety. So troubled are we about people drowning in their attempts to get to safety that if they don't drown, we punish them. I'm still trying to work through that. The drownings excuse, which both parties have used, is a lie. We need to understand quite plainly the political reality in Australia at the moment is that both major parties are lying to us about their apparent concern for asylum seekers. They make it sound respectable because they don't want people dying in front of us. They don't care if they die somewhere else. They talk about people dying, so what do? It started as stop the boats, which meant stop the boats from setting out. It morphed into stop the boats from arriving. And in order to do that, we bribe the people smugglers to take them back, or we push the boat backs, or we transfer them into the orange buckets and send them back. One of the things that has not been recognised in the public at large, or at least the Murdoch-reading public at large, is that Section 73 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code creates the offence of people smuggling. It has three elements, and that is that a person either... I'm sorry, I'm not talking about it. It's really stressing. Is that okay? Can you hear at the back?
It's going to feed back. Can you take down the mid-range a little bit?
Yeah, turn it down. Look, a glass of red would be good, but I think the amplifiers are right. Anyway, what was I saying?
I'll cut it down.
Section 73 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code identifies the crime of people smuggling as three elements: that a person arranges or facilitates the entry of a person into a country of which they're not a national, bypassing the usual entry controls. Now, when we push boats back, we are facilitating the entry of people who are not Indonesian nationals into Indonesia, circumventing the usual entry arrangements. We are engaged in the crime of people smuggling in order to, quote-unquote, protect our borders. Now, I don't care whether you think that the asylum seeker policy is good or bad or indifferent. No matter how good a person might think it is, government should not engage in criminal activities to give effect to a policy, and we are doing precisely that. Now, there was a bit of a dispute about whether the payments that were made to the people smugglers amounted to a criminal offence, because I think that means ASIS did it and they are immune from criminal prosecution. It doesn't matter, because they boast about the turnbacks, and the turnbacks amount to the crime of people smuggling. Australia hates people smugglers, but we're engaged. By the way, the hatred of people smugglers, just as a side note, John Howard made a lot about this. He said, you know, people smugglers, shocking, Kevin Rudd did the same, scum of the earth, lowest of the low, all that stuff. It's an interesting thing to remember that Oskar Schindler, who we all thought was quite a decent guy in the book and the film, he was a people smuggler. Mm-hmm. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was Kevin Rudd's moral hero, he was a people smuggler. And John Howard should recognise that in The Sound of Music, the Von Trapp family, the refugees and the nuns were people smugglers. Yay! Now, as part of our attempt to protect ourselves from the dreadful sight of refugees drowning off Christmas Island, we engage in a process of cruel treatment which is calculated to persuade others not to even bother coming and asking for our help. This has three major elements. First, when they arrive at Christmas Island, they should immediately be warned that they are going to be treated badly. I've spoken to a number of doctors, employees of IHMS, who worked on Christmas Island, and one of them told me that here's the standard procedure. People arrive, they have typically spent 8 or 10 days in a boat on the ocean. They've typically come from countries that are landlocked. They've typically never seen the ocean, let alone been on it. They've typically had not enough food to eat on the voyage. They've typically had no opportunity to wash or change their clothes on the voyage. They typically arrive in clothing caked with their own excrement, and before they are allowed to wash and change, they're interviewed by a member of the Immigration Department. A needless humiliation which might send them a signal that this is not a country that acts pleasantly. And then, if they have any medications, those are taken from them and not returned. One person apparently has a full-time job sitting in front of a rubbish bin, popping pills out of blister packs for later destruction. If they have medical documentation, it's taken from them and not returned. If they have any medical appliances, so hearing aids, spectacles, false teeth, prosthetic limbs, they're taken and not returned. These are people who are, if they arrive with medical conditions, those conditions go untreated and undiagnosed because every possible pointer to them is taken and not returned. Now the doctor, one of the doctors there told me of a very difficult interview she had, consultation she had with a woman. This woman had been in detention on Christmas Island for about, I think, a month, and she was generally regarded as insane. And the doctor wanted to know what the insanity was about so that she may be able to get some medication. It was a difficult consultation because although they were on opposite sides of a table, the interpreter was 4,000 kilometres away at the end of a phone line. But after about 20 minutes, the doctor worked out that the problem was that this woman was incontinent of urine, and she could not leave her cabin without having urine running down her leg, and it was driving her insane. The doctor said to the department, this lady needs incontinence pads. Their initial response was, we don't do those. The doctor insisted. The department relented and agreed to provide 4 per day. More than that is regarded as a fire hazard. She has to queue up for more as she needs them. But as soon as her real problem was dealt with, her behaviour became normal. Now, what justification is there in a civilised nation for treating anyone that way? Anyone at all? Then they get to Nauru, or they get to Manus Island. Nauru is for women, family groups. Manus is for unaccompanied men. On Nauru, they're held in various compounds. They are, of course, held in detention, even though they've committed no offence, and they are subjected to very uncomfortable conditions, and they're daily humiliated, and children notoriously only respond to their boat numbers, not their names. They're called by their boat numbers and not by their names. But the Australian company that runs the detention system on Nauru, Transfield Services, a Sydney-based company, Transfield Services hands out requisition forms so that a detainee can say, I need a bar of soap, or I need a toothbrush. And they can hand those in to the Wilson Security Guards. Wilson Security, another Australian company that runs the security in the detention systems on Manus and Nauru. And they hand in their requisition form to the security guards at the entry to each of the compounds. One of the security guards on Nauru told me that these requisition forms are a standing joke, and at the end of each day they throw them out. They don't even get back to Transfield. On Manus, of course, things are notoriously dreadful, and perhaps the clearest insight that I got into what's going on at Manus was at a meeting I held in my chambers a month or two ago. I had 5 previous health workers who'd worked for IHMS on Manus, and a detainee who had spent 18 months on Manus before he abandoned his claim for protection and returned to Iran. He attended the meeting by Skype. And I had a senior Labor parliamentarian who I've known for a long time. And one of the former health workers really struck a chord. He's not a bleeding heart like me. He spent his professional career in the prison system in Australia. But he decided to go and spend a year on Manus because the pay was pretty good. So he got to Manus, and he said 3 things that struck me in particular. First, when he first got to the compounds at Manus Island, his immediate inner reaction was, this is what Auschwitz must have been like. Second, after a couple of months, he thought that the conditions in which they're held and the way in which they're treated was 100 times worse than he's seen in any Australian prison. These are people who've not committed any offence, but we treat them worse than we treat prisoners in our prison system. And third, by the end of his year on Manus, he was convinced that just below the surface, never clearly articulated, but just below the surface, the purpose of the way they're treated is to break their spirits so they will abandon their claim for protection and agree to return to face the persecution they've fled. That's Australia in action for you. And it's disgraceful. Now, I challenged this ALP person. He's a person I know who has real concern for refugees. And I said, how do you how do you respond to stuff like that? He said, it's shocking. I was appalled. I couldn't believe such things were happening. But, he said, it would be political suicide for us to take a soft line on boats. There's politics, Australia 2015 style. You abandon principle, abandon what you believe, because if you want to pursue power, you just have to look at the real politics of it. It's one of the most alarming things that I think I've ever experienced. The tragedy of this is that we spend vast amounts mistreating people when there are rational alternatives. Now, Phil gave you an insight into the cost of this system, a system which is calculated to be harmful and is undoubtedly harmful, and which brutalises not only the people who are held by us, but the people who are doing it, and the country more broadly. I mean, you know, he referred to the original boat people who arrived in 1788. I think it's fascinating that the one group in our society who've never really complained about boat people is the Aborigines. They're the ones who really could, but they don't. Let me suggest two alternatives, because anyone you speak to in the community, if you get their attention, they'll say, yeah, well, how else? What else is there you can do? Well, one possibility, do what Malcolm Fraser did in the late 70s. We know that people heading down this way arrive in Malaysia or Indonesia. When they hit Indonesia, it's the end of the line. There's nowhere to go there except by getting on a boat or sweating it out in the shadows for 20 years or 30 years until someone resettles you, and all the time at risk of being thrown in detention, because Malaysia and Indonesia have not signed the Refugees Convention. So set up a fair income processing system there. Now, you know, Phil said UNHCR's got an annual budget of $3 and a bit billion Australian each year. Well, why don't we sling them $1 billion a year with a specific request that that be used to process asylum claims of people who arrive in Malaysia or Indonesia, and then offer them swift, safe resettlement in Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, any other countries we can rope in. Now, you could say to them, you will be safely resettled in 2.5 months or 3.5 months. Don't even think about using a people smuggler. The people smuggling trade would stop dead straight away. And if we were genuinely worried about people drowning, that's an approach which might work. Now, of course, if you do that, if you make the last step safe, then instead of there being 90+% of boat people being assessed by us as refugees genuinely entitled to protection, you'll get some tire kickers coming along. That's just human nature. That would be a demographic problem for Indonesia and Malaysia. We'd have to do something to make that work for them. Maybe $500 million each per year. But since we're spending $5 billion a year, we could get out of it for $2 billion a year. We'd help people and do no harm. Seems to me quite a good saving. $5 billion a year, by the way, it's a fascinating number. And I mean, you know, there are various estimates of how much we're actually spending to keep the boats away, but call it $5 billion a year. I've heard one Liberal parliamentarian say it's as high as $8 or $10 billion a year, but let's say $5 billion, that's realistic. That's 1 million Geelong chopper rides per year. Now, if we can't attract the cooperation of Malaysia or Indonesia, then let's say, okay, we'll stop the deliberate cruelty. We'll stop suborning our neighbours in PNG and Nauru. We will stop offshore processing. And if people arrive in Australia, we will detain them initially. I'm not against initial detention. I'm not into open borders. But limit the detention to 1 month. Absolutely 1 month maximum. Unless a court orders, for some reason, shown a longer period of detention. 1 month maximum. Use that month for preliminary health and security checks, and then release them into the community on an interim visa pending refugee status determination. And the interim visa would have 4 major conditions. First, they must stay in touch with the department, so they can't just evaporate and disappear from sight. Second, they're allowed to work, basic to human dignity.
Yep.
They're allowed full access to Centrelink and Medicare benefits because they are human beings. And fourth, critically, until their refugee status is decided, they must live in a specified regional or rural town or city. Okay? Now, let's make some assumptions. We know that the long-term average of boat arrivals is around about 2,000 people per year. It's up and down, it tracks in parallel with international movements of refugees, but there was a spike in 2012 when 25,000 people arrived. Let's pretend, against all the evidence, let's pretend that 25,000 becomes the new normal. And let's pretend, against all the evidence, that every single one of them remains on full Centrelink benefits for the whole time. What does that cost us? $500 million a year. 10% of what we presently spend brutalising them. And that $500 million a year, that would be spent, all of it, in the failing economies of regional towns and cities.
Yes.
On accommodation, food, clothing. There's not a lot left over when you're on full Centrelink benefits. So we could actually do some good for regional towns. We wouldn't be clogging up the traffic in Lindsay. Not if they're in Wagga or Hay or wherever else. We would be doing some good for the regional economy. We'd be doing some good for the refugees, and we'd be saving the country about $4.5 million a year. I would have thought Joe Hockey would see the benefits of that, although his approach to libel action suggests that he's not really into rational investment. But more than economic rationalism, which never appeals to me as a great argument, we would by this rescue this country. We are on a terrible, dangerous moral slide. I don't know where it's going to end. I was horrified when the Labor National Convention decided to make common cause with the coalition on mistreatment of boat people. We are in very dangerous territory. I do not want to see this country turn into an ugly monster in the next few years. It's going that way. If we rethink the way we deal with asylum seekers, we can rescue this country. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to do exactly that.